am firmly convinced of the value of a great books education in whatever context you pursue it. But I'm also convinced of the particular value of studying the great books with Mr. Hinrichs, who I think is uniquely gifted in his education and his experience to walk this road with you. There is no universe in which I would have been able, at the age of 12, to open the Iliad and have anything but the most superficial understanding of what it was that I was reading. And the same would have been true if I had tried to read Augustine or Aquinas or Marx or Kant, either on my own or with a written curriculum as my guide. So the richness and the depth of understanding that come from the Great Books tutorial are the direct result, in my view, of having a tutor who has gone before you and who is willing not to hold your hand, not to feed you a particular answer, but to show you the way, to invite you into this conversation. I have two younger sisters, one who has completed the program and one who is now in Great Books 4. And watching them grow in grace and his wisdom under Mr. Hinrichs' teaching has been tremendously encouraging and also very convicting, as I realize very often that their understanding has surpassed my own. So for many, many reasons, I am deeply grateful for the work of Fritz and Christy Hinrichs and for the tremendous blessing they've been in my life and in the life of my family.
I went on to study at Cornell and study abroad at Oxford. These are some of the best educational institutions in the world, and I can say without a doubt that the education I got in the great books was better than the education I got for $250,000. And I think the reason that is that we read books. How profound is that? Even in university-level philosophy courses, you're reading excerpts, you're reading paragraphs. You're not getting a real sense of what Mr. H taught was the great conversation. The sense that Western civilization began in ancient Greece, was transmitted to Rome, to medieval Christianity, through the Reformation, through the Enlightenment, to modernity, and then that in these various tracks of philosophy and history and literature and science and mathematics, that there's a set of responses. People are working with, people in ancient Rome, their education was to read the works of ancient Greece, and so on and so forth, and just built. So people were responding, they were standing on the shoulders of giants, to use Newton's phrase. And I felt that everything before I started the Great Books program and almost everything else that I did in my education was of very little value by comparison to having this structure, this framework for thinking about the world in which I live and how we got here and the ideas and the history that we were responding to. Original sources are powerful. I remember taking a graduate level course in history. I think we were studying Alexander the Great's campaigns and learning that, really having this experience that academia is this inverted pyramid. You have a very small set of original sources who are the people living at the time saying, this is important, I need to write this down, I need to record my thoughts about it. And then you have the people that come a generation later that comment on that. And then you have the people that comment on the commentators and the comment on the commentators of the commentators, and it builds up from that, and eventually it becomes completely pointless. Very dry, very boring stuff. But the stuff at the bottom is rich. I just had this sense while going through the great books that I had to respect the book I was reading because somebody took the time to write it and really cared. Whereas when you're reading a high school textbook, you feel like you're part of some system that is accredited and somebody is being paid to write a book that compiles things, and there's no real sense of importance.
What I loved and what was significant about the great books for me was the fact that we'd get a text, an original text to read each week, and we'd have a week to come up with our own ideas and our own deductions from what we'd read to share. And I think that process challenged me a lot, not just as a student in the classroom, but as an individual, of what was significant or what was meaningful or what I could apply to my own perspective on life from what I was reading. And to be able to challenge myself to formulate arguments and to present them to my peers, as opposed to the AP classes or the high school classes that I would take where you'd basically get a text that was so generic and overread that it had almost become cliche, and then you'd get a piece of paper and you'd answer questions, and the way you would mark your intelligence was how, like the others, your answers were, how you could get information and then just regurgitate it. And I'm a writer, I'm a singer-songwriter, and I remember coming across this quote relatively recently that says, you think your story of love and heartbreak is unprecedented in the history of the world, and then you read. And it's in those books that you realize that your story and your pain is what actually connects you to the rest of the world. And one thing that I've been so blessed by with GBT is that it really opened my eyes and my mind to the world of knowledge and just a wealth of story and history and perspective and philosophy. And there's so much richness that comes from a life filled with reading.
So I'm a junior at Hillsdale College, and I came in to their Western Heritage and English Great Books courses, and I had read probably 70% of what we had read in those classes. And my teachers were all very impressed, and they said, we have a lot of students coming to us saying that we've mastered these texts already in high school. Why are we reading them again? And they asked me, why do you feel like it's necessary to read them again? And I said that in my high school, I got the opportunity to be introduced to great authors and become familiarized with these conversations. And the idea that I could have a familiarity with what Kant is saying versus what John Locke is saying. And so introduced to these authors and then have the opportunity to know that any great book is worth rereading and rereading and rereading. And so now my understanding is formed in a different way. And it caused me to come to the text with a humility, knowing that I'd read these before and I could keep rereading them every year of my life and still get a better understanding. I think that reading the more difficult texts of literature is both important and rewarding because an encounter with these truths from the author on a first-hand basis is an irreplaceable experience. Because encountering these texts on a first-hand experience provides you with an experience of these truths and ideas in a different way than a textbook could or a lesser work of literature could, because we believe that these authors are great because of the skill with which they express these truths. And something that is challenging isn't negative because it's challenging. It can reap greater fruits in the formation of your mind and in your education in later life because of the difficulty and challenge of encountering these texts.
I think having a basis of literature that we've shared certainly has given us a lot of richness to move forward and contemplate new ideas or encounter new ideas together, because we've had a basis that we know from the past, and that we've taken the time to consider these things and developed a habit of speaking about them together. So we have a shared language, a shared history, a shared literature history, as well as developing those tools and those the muscles in your mind to read and consider and evaluate and then connect it to everything else you've read. So every time you encounter a new situation or a new book or a new sermon, we already have the habit of discussing it together, and which has led to a lot of conclusions.
Look, there's a long tradition and a strong and important one in education that you have a shared canon, or that you're reading from the same bookshelf, not because you want the same thoughts, but that you have common ground or an understanding with your companion or with your workers, with your fellow students or scholars. There's no discussion without at least some common basis. And in the Western world, those would be the great books.
One of the important things about reading more difficult, more condensed books is that it makes education less scary. A lot of times you see it's easy to embrace certain ideas or certain books because they're expressed in ways that are really difficult and therefore they must be true, or to listen to people telling you things and they're saying it in a very intelligent way, therefore it must be true. But going through this 5 years, a big variety of very difficult books sometimes gives you a better picture, I think, of philosophy as something. It's just a lot of valuable people trying to make sense of the world, no matter how hard the books themselves are. Yeah, one thing I did notice about college is that There's a lot of people in the world who are very concerned with doing well in education, but not too many people who are very interested in learning. That's one thing I think the Great Books program did for me, was taught me the importance of learning not just information that will help me get a better job, but just knowledge of the world in general and how beautiful the world is. Just one thing about GBT, I guess, is it's not just for the English majors and philosophy majors of the world. You know, learning from the great books and the classics is something that grows you as a person, whether you become philosophy minor, English major, or a bioengineering major in the future. So great books is for everyone.